We're going to wrap this up by picking back up where we left off. And so we were looking at malfeasance and mayhem in the Highlands, high crimes and felonies. So we're going to label this as part two. And we're just going to talk about the methodology that was used in order to remove the people from the lands in Ireland, Scotland, Cornwall, Wales. And so it was a similar process across the land. And there's also a connection between the dynamics that took place in Ireland and what took place in parts of Spain. And so there were these unusual similarities with respect to what the people were enduring. And so you also see these dynamics throughout history of this, removing people, making things very difficult for people so that they feel like they don't have any alternative other than to actually leave their homeland. And so you saw this with the indigenous people of America. So they left their homelands and went to Oklahoma and all over the place. And you also saw this in Africa. You saw this in Europe. And so there is this bizarre pattern of making things very difficult for people so that people are willing to relocate. And so you see that pattern going on today, but you also see this in the past. And they were very diligent about this entire process and this identity theft that they were engaging in. And so this is just going to give you a little bit more food for thought so that you can, conceptualize exactly what was taking place when numerous ancestors were being uprooted and moved. And just as a reminder, you're going to, if you're looking for these ancestors, track these surnames back to these passenger and immigration lists, find the entry date into the Americas, and then trace forward from there. And we've seen these depictions before. This is the coastal area of Scotland. If you haven't seen part one already, go back and look at part one and then pick up here after you watch part one. And so with that original list for those persons of quality, again, you had individuals who were immigrating with an E. You had religious exiles, you know that, political rebels, men who were sold for a term of years. And what's really interesting is you have a number of individuals who sort of discount this, like this was no big deal. This was just a job they had. What this tells you is something about the individual and also tells you something about their ancestors. And there is a particular American Indian group that tends to minimize some of these things that have taken place. And it really calls into question the legitimacy of that particular collective. You also see people minimizing slavery, period. And so it brings up the question of whether their ancestors were ever enslaved. And so there's this minimizing, there's also glorying in it. You hear some individuals talking about, well, the Indians were enslaving people. And they take great pleasure in talking about this. But the question is, were the Indians really enslaving people? Because when I look at the records, I see Indians who were enslaved. But carrying on here. So you have individuals who were serving apprenticeships. Again, the stolen children. These people were bold and wicked. Maidens pressed, and others who went from Great Britain to the American plantations. Now, of course, you have all of these individuals who will try to convince you, many of them identify as Hebrew Israelite, they will try to convince you that these original enslaved people were quote unquote white people. And then they brag about that. And of course, that brings up the question also of why are people complaining? So if dark people were enslaving lighter people, stop complaining. As a matter of fact, if that's your narrative, then it is you and your family that owes reparations. So moving right along here. So this original list is coming from 1600 to 1700. And with this, when you look in this text, you can see all sorts of information about the people that were transported. And again, you have all of those conflations with some of those ships that were going to Africa, and this whole dynamic of transport and what the identities were of the people as they moved from one place to the next. And so they were being deported initially out of Europe, but then for some of them, it appears that they changed status and became enslaved individuals once they were leaving out of Africa, coming to the Americas. Same people, just given a different label. And again, this is a collection of the names of the immigrant ancestors of many thousands of American families. This person's last name is really interesting. Houghton brings up the question of where does that Hottentot name come from? And here again, you see this list of ships that were moving people from Europe into Virginia specifically. You also make note of the fact that you had a ship named Jacob and a ship named James. To be clear here, this is not to indicate that Jacob was on the ship or James, also Jacob, was on the ship. This could simply be James owning the ship or Jacob owning the ship or an individual simply liking the name James and Jacob and giving the ships those names. You also see Sarah and Samuel. You see quite a bit of biblical reference here. And here you have some additional ship names. You also might want to cross-reference some of this with the ships going back and forth with respect to the transatlantic slave trade, because remember, we found correlations before with these ships. And so they waged a unique type of war on the Highlanders, on the Europeans, period. And so, in many instances, they were not even aware that a war was being waged. They were just victimized by it all. It also brings up the question of whether these individuals were also reflecting on biblical prophecy and passively going along with all of this because they placed themselves in the biblical prophetic narratives. And so when individuals place themselves in these biblical prophetic narratives, sometimes nihilism creeps in. And so individuals may feel as though you have this divine destiny going on and there's really nothing that can be done. This is the way that things are supposed to be. And so they just accept anything. There's no pushback. They just got on the boat. And so you see this going on with these narratives. And again, it does bring up the question of whether there was acceptance of this as sort of a fate, as sort of a divine destiny. They were going back, you hear people talk about this, they were going back to Egypt in ships. And remember, the Scots people believed that they were from Egypt in the first place, and they came over with Queen Scotia. So anything is possible. And so we already touched on this, that there was this fabricated inflation. Sound familiar? So they created an inflation in order to make it very difficult for the people. This is not politics. This is simple wickedness. This is psychopathology. This is psychopathy. I mean, only a person who's operating from that framework would be even thinking about doing these things. Most people are just busy living their lives, but when people start planning and plotting and scheming to create all of this havoc, something else is going on. They also are probably quite bored and they have a very high threshold for excitement and equilibrium. And so for many people, they need all of this chaos in order to just simply feel okay. So we've got the rent raising, the removal beyond the sea, and then the replacements. And so you can even see that now. There have been times when individuals who identify as white have indicated that they believe there is a plan afoot to remove them. And so they have some concerns, but then individuals will sort of dismiss that as a form of sort of a white supremacy. But the question is there any merit to what they are saying? Because you do see manifestations of, a push towards what you consider race mixing or phenotype mixing. You see this diminishing of these distinct groups in favor of all of these Creole identities. And so it's not far fetched what some of them are thinking about this idea of removing them, annihilation. It's not really far fetched when you consider some of the behaviors of individuals. And so right now you also see these replacement demography dynamics going on. And so, at one point you had individuals who were in the Americas uh, given priority, given notoriety in terms of the Americas and being citizens in the Americas. But what you see now is a sort of a quiet takeover and a replacement in terms of the original people in the land. So it's worse than it was before, because if you even look at ads and things like that, you no longer really see those people that were called African American or those people were called American Indian. You don't see them in prominent spaces. It's almost as if they've just disappeared. But what you see is a replacement with other brown people. So you'll see people from Africa. You'll see people from India. You'll see people from China. You'll see people from different islands. Now, some islands you don't really see represented, and that's also very interesting. But what you see is this sort of moving from whatever people happened to be there originally to a totally different group of people or groups of people who are now taking on the identities of these people who appear to be almost just disappearing. You just don't really see them as much. It may feel like you see them as much, but if you really analyze the media, you will see that there is significant replacement going on. And even when you hear about, bragging about something that someone of color did, you will generally hear that the individual is not indigenous to the Americas. And so you will hear of the individual actually being from another place, but then being placed on a pedestal. And so you see this quite a bit going on, and it's continuing to escalate for whatever reason. Okay, so we're going to look at what the dynamics were in Scotland that led to the removals in the first place. Hopefully, you remember the origin of fried chicken and its Scots roots. And so we're going to call this fried chicken and sheep fiasco, because what happened with the removal was that people were replaced with other people, but also with sheep. And so, by the way, the Scots people are not unaware of what has taken place. And in fact, if you recall, there is almost an obsession in Scotland with Benin and the history of Benin. They know just about everything in terms of their historians about what happened with Benin and that kingdom known as Judah Gouda. And so it indicates here the Highland clearances remain a controversial period in Scotland's history and are still talked of with great bitterness, particularly by those families who were dispossessed of their land and even to a large extent of their culture over the period of around 100 years between the 1700s and the 1800s. It is still considered a stain on the history of the Scottish people and is also a main contributing factor for the relatively enormous worldwide Scottish diaspora. And it indicates here by the mid 1800s there was a tangible north south divide within Scotland. Sounds like the United States, doesn't it? Okay, there was an idea of the Highland culture and way of life being backward and old-fashioned and out of step with the rest of Scotland and the recently United Kingdom. That United Kingdom name is very interesting because the United Kingdom, that whole idea of United Kingdom is biblical. And so the United Kingdom is really this construct related to the North and South Kingdoms coming from Jacob. So it's very interesting that they have this name. It says those people in the South now identified more with their Southern counterparts than with the old clan culture of the Highlands and Islands. And so Southern Scots saw themselves as more modern and progressive and more in common language and culture with their Southern English neighbors. And so there were these cultural dynamics that were going on over there, and then they brought these same cultural dynamics right over into the Americas and probably everywhere else that they went to. And things became increasingly worse after the Glorious Revolution, as they called it, for those clans. And then the Stuarts were replaced by William of Orange. But you had all of these Scots who were loyal to the Stuart monarch. And so there were these uprisings, that kept coming up as they were trying to reclaim the throne. So they saw the William of Orange dynamic as a fake monarchy. They did not see him as legitimate, or that little dynasty. They did not see that as legitimate. And if you recall, we read where there was an assertion about him not being legitimate and about him not caring about the people the way the Stuart clans did. And so it's very interesting. It's in that Ritchie book. And so you can see it there where there's that sort of conversation about the legitimacy of that throne and also about not being tied to the actual clans. There's also a dynamic with King James where he was trying to distance the clan chiefs from the actual people because he wanted them to be loyal to him, even though he wasn't going back and forth to Scotland. But he wanted those people to be loyal to him. He didn't want there to be an uprising. So it's very interesting dynamic going on there with King James in this situation. So he did not have a lot of trust for the Jacobites, essentially, the people who came to be the Jacobites. He didn't have as much faith in them as some of his descendants did. And so, again, it's a very interesting dynamic with King James and the Scots people. And you can read a little bit more about that because you also can read some things about his mother and her relationship with England, her relationship with Scotland. It's very interesting. And so they ask, really, what was the reason for all of this chaos? And the offering is that it was money. However, there's a little bit more going on there than just money. People will blame things like money when it's really the human being simply making a choice. Money is just an excuse. Sometimes people are just simply wicked. And there's an attempt to reframe that and call it something like, oh, they're just greedy or whatever. So anyway, it indicates here it was not only Highland culture that disappeared over this period, but also the Highlanders themselves. Okay. And so they are indicating that they disappeared because of money. It was deduced by those landowners on whose lands the clans lived and worked that sheep were going to be more financially productive than people. Another thing to point out here is, and this goes back to that whole King James sort of separating the clan chiefs from the people. These people were actually betrayed by the clan chiefs. So the people for their tribe, their clan, the people that they thought were representing them, they were betraying them. The people that they thought were representing them, they were bought out. And so that's what really took place. And some people don't want to deal with that, but that's what took place. They were bought out, and now we have what we have. And so it indicates, so what followed was an organized and intentional removal of the population from the area in 1747. And we've looked at some stuff from 1747. Another act was passed, the Heritable Jurisdictions Act. And so these individuals, if they didn't submit, so to speak, they automatically forfeited their land, bend the knee, or surrender your birthright. And so the narrative continues on, indicating that some Highlander clans and families had lived in the same cottages for 500 years. And then, just like that, they were gone. People were literally turned out of their cottages into the surrounding countryside. Okay, some of them turned to subsistence farming, but things were not profitable for them. And so essentially, they were sold out and they didn't really have legal rights to the land. Now, remember, some of these people in different parts of the UK are in those Domesday books. And so they actually did have legal rights to some of this land. It indicates that this was a very feudal arrangement and that many of the Highlanders chose to immigrate. Okay, but the trick was they chose to immigrate, but then they were actually sold as indentured slaves. And so it goes on to indicate that things began to deteriorate even further in the 1840s, and then you had the potato blight and the potato famine. And so the other thing that took place, this is where you get to that wickedness stuff, is that as many as 2,000 crofter cottages were burned each day. So they were just burning these people out. Although the exact figures are hard to come by, they know that the numbers were substantial. And so these cottages were burned in order to make them uninhabitable. And this ensured that the people would never try to come back to where they left. And so once they immigrated, there was really nothing to go back to. It's almost like Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. And then there's an indication that between 1811 and 1821, around 15,000 people were removed from land owned by the Duchess of Sutherland and her husband, the Marquis of Stafford, in order to make room for 200,000 sheep. And so the individuals who were turned out literally had nowhere to go. Many of them were older, many of them were ill, infirm, and so many of them starved or froze to death. They were left to the mercy of the elements as they just took their stuff and took their lives. And so what's also interesting is that you had these individuals who were turned out. They got on these ships and then they got sick on the ships. And so they had typhus by the time they arrived in Canada. They were sick by the time they got off of these boats landing in the Americas. Now, this was a very interesting notation. I'm looking for the depictions of this Duchess of Sutherland and the Marquis of Stafford. This woman pops up, and then Marquis Stafford pops up. And what this speaks to is this affinity for brown people, many brown people, for naming their sons Marquis. Naming their sons these names that sort of harken back to places in Europe. And so they sound like they are related to being quote unquote African American. But when you trace those names back, they trace right back to different places in Europe. Names like Dante. Okay. And so here interestingly, you have Marquis of Stafford, and what comes up is Marquis Stafford. And so here, as we're wrapping this up, it indicates the clearing of the population is a main contributor to the massive worldwide Scottish diaspora, and why so many Americans and Canadians can trace their ancestry to the proud ancient clans of Scotland. You also see this, of course, in Jamaica. Jamaica's flag is an indicator of this connection. It indicates also it is not known exactly how many Highlanders immigrated voluntarily or otherwise at this time, but estimates put it at about 70,000. Whatever the exact figure, it was enough to change the character and culture of the Scottish Highlands for forever. There's an interesting prophecy at the end of this, and this is from the 17th century Scottish prophet known as the Brehon Seer. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it indicates the day will come when the big sheep will put the plow up in the rafters. The big sheep will overrun the country till they meet the northern sea. In the end, the old people will return from the new lands, essentially. And here we see this interesting Scottish earthwork. Well, we're going to wrap this up, and we're going to end with something a little different. Yes, knowledge is power, but it's only power if you do something with it.